Catherine Marlowe stood on the veranda of Oak Ridge Plantation, fanning herself against the oppressive August heat. When she first laid eyes on him, the wagon rolled up the long dirt road, dust kicking up behind it and hanging in the still air like a drawn curtain. Beside the driver sat her husband, Richard Marlowe, gesturing animatedly, as he always did when he'd made what he considered a shrewd purchase. But it was the figure chained in the back of the wagon that made Catherine's breath catch in her throat. He was massive, even-seated, hunched forward with his wrists shackled to the wagon bed. He dwarfed the two guards, positioned on either side of him. His shoulders were so broad they seemed to eclipse the sun behind him. His hands, even bound, looked capable of crushing a man's skull with little effort. And yet there was something strange about him, a quality Catherine couldn't quite name. He kept his head down, his posture submissive, almost defeated. He coughed periodically, a wet, rattling sound that hinted at illness. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, as though he'd recently lost weight. "Catherine," Richard called out as the wagon came to a halt. "Come see what I've acquired. Wait until you see the size of this one. He'll do the work of 3 men. Catherine descended the steps slowly, her silk skirts rustling, her hand gripping the railing. Over the years, she had seen many slaves arrive at Oak Ridge. The plantation currently held 43, but none had ever looked quite like this. As she approached, the giant raised his head slightly, just enough for her to glimpse his eyes. They were dark, intelligent, and for the briefest moment, something flashed across them. Something that looked almost like calculation. Before he lowered his gaze again and coughed into his bound hands. "He's sick," Catherine observed, stepping back instinctively. "Richard, you didn't pay full price for a sick slave, did you?" Richard laughed, the sound booming across the yard. "Minor ailment, nothing more. The seller assured me it's just exhaustion from the journey. A few days of rest and proper feeding, and he'll be strong as an ox. Look at the size of him, Catherine. Those arms, those shoulders. I got him for half what I'd normally pay because of that cough. It's the deal of the year." Catherine wasn't so certain. There was something about the giant that unsettled her, though she couldn't put it into words. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself. That strange mix of apparent weakness and latent power. Or perhaps it was something in his eyes during that fleeting moment he'd looked at her. A depth that suggested more awareness than was comfortable. "What's his name?" she asked. "Calls himself Jonas," Richard replied, signaling to the guards to unchain the prisoner. "Says he was a field hand on a plantation in South Carolina before his master died and the property was liquidated. Strong worker, no history of running or rebellion. Perfect addition to our operation." As the chains were removed, Jonas stood slowly, and Catherine had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He must have been nearly 7 feet tall, with a frame that suggested immense strength, despite the apparent illness. He swayed slightly, as if dizzy, and caught himself against the wagon. One of the guards laughed. "Careful, big man. Don't want to fall and hurt yourself before you've done any work." Jonas said nothing, just nodded submissively and allowed himself to be led toward the slave quarters. Catherine watched him go, that uneasy feeling persisting in her chest like a stone. She had been raised on a plantation, had lived her entire 28 years in the world of slavery, and had developed certain instincts about the people her husband owned. Something about Jonas felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly. He seemed too weak, too submissive to be dangerous. But wrong nonetheless. "You worry too much," Richard said, draping an arm around her shoulders. "He's just a big, simple field hand. Nothing to concern yourself with. Now, shall we go inside?" I'm famished, and I'm sure Bessie has prepared something delicious for dinner." Catherine allowed herself to be led inside, but she glanced back once more at the figure of Jonas disappearing into the quarters. She couldn't shake the feeling that her husband had brought something onto their plantation that would change everything. She just didn't know yet whether that change would be for better or worse. What Catherine didn't know, what no one at Oak Ridge Plantation knew, was that Jonas wasn't his real name, that he hadn't been a field hand in South Carolina, that he had never been submissive or simple or weak, and that the cough, the hunched posture, the appearance of illness were all carefully constructed lies designed to accomplish one specific purpose: infiltration. His real name was Elijah. He was 32 years old, and he was a hunter. Before we continue with this revenge story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Thank you. And let's keep going. 6 months earlier, February 1857, Tennessee, Elijah had been born free in a small community of free black people in the mountains of Tennessee. His father, Samuel, had been a legendary tracker and hunter who had escaped slavery 20 years before Elijah's birth and had never been recaptured. Samuel had taught his son everything he knew about tracking game, reading signs in the forest, understanding animal behavior, moving silently through wilderness, and, most importantly, how to think like a predator. A hunter doesn't chase his prey, Samuel had told him when he was just a boy. A hunter understands his prey. He learns its habits, its weaknesses, its fears, and then he sets a trap so perfect that the prey walks into it willingly. Elijah had become one of the finest hunters in the region, providing meat for his community and occasionally guiding wealthy white men on hunting expeditions, men who paid well and never asked questions about his status because his skills were too valuable. He had a wife, a small cabin, and a life that, while not easy in a nation that despised his skin color, even when he was technically free, was at least his own. Then, 3 years ago, everything had changed. His mother, Ruth, had been born enslaved on a plantation in Georgia called Oak Ridge. She had escaped when Elijah was just an infant, traveling hundreds of miles north with him, wrapped in a blanket against her chest, following the North Star and the whispered directions of the Underground Railroad. She had found Samuel, had built a life, had tasted freedom. But 20 years later, slave catchers had found her. They had come in the night with dogs and chains and a legal document that declared her the property of Richard Marlowe of Oak Ridge Plantation, Georgia. The law didn't care that she had lived free for 2 decades, didn't care that she had a husband and a grown son, didn't care that forcing her back into slavery was a cruelty that defied every principle of human decency. The Fugitive Slave Act was clear. Escaped slaves could be captured and returned to their owners, no matter how long they had been free, no matter where they were found. Elijah had been away on a hunting trip when it happened. By the time he returned, his mother was gone. His father had tried to stop them and had been beaten so badly he couldn't walk. The cabin had been ransacked, and pinned to the door was a notice: property of Richard Marlowe, Oak Ridge Plantation, Georgia, legally reclaimed. Elijah had held his father while the old man wept. Samuel, who had escaped slavery and built a life and taught his son to be strong and free, had been powerless to protect the woman he loved. "I'm sorry," Samuel kept saying. "I'm sorry. I couldn't stop them. There were too many. I couldn't stop them." "It's not your fault," Elijah had told him. But inside, a cold fury was building. His mother was back in chains because of a man named Richard Marlowe. Back on a plantation called Oak Ridge, back in a world of violence and degradation and stolen humanity. and Elijah was going to get her back. But he wasn't foolish. He knew he couldn't simply walk onto a plantation and demand his mother's release. He knew that a direct assault would end with him dead or enslaved himself. So he did what his father had taught him to do. He studied his prey. He learned everything he could about Oak Ridge Plantation, about Richard Marlowe, about the layout of the property and the number of overseers and the security measures in place. What he learned was daunting. Oak Ridge was one of the largest plantations in Georgia, with over 400 acres of cotton and tobacco fields. Richard Marlowe was wealthy, well-connected, and known for his harsh treatment of enslaved people. The plantation employed 6 overseers, all of them armed and experienced. There were dogs, patrols, and a reputation for brutally punishing any slave who attempted escape. A direct rescue was impossible, but infiltration, that might work. So Elijah had devised a plan that was audacious to the point of madness. He would get himself sold to Richard Marlowe. He would enter Oak Ridge Plantation not as a rescuer, but as property. Once inside, he would gather information, find his mother, and execute an escape that would free not just her, but as many others as possible. And in the process, he would destroy Richard Marlowe's operation so thoroughly that the man would never recover. It took 6 months of preparation. Elijah had to learn to act like a slave, to adopt the posture, the speech patterns, the submissive behavior that white people expected. He had to suppress every instinct that made him free and strong. He had to become, at least externally, the kind of property that would be bought and sold. The hardest part was allowing himself to be captured. He had traveled south to the borders of slave territory and had deliberately allowed a slave patrol to find him. He had claimed to be a runaway from a plantation in South Carolina, had given false information about his owner, had acted confused and frightened and weak. The patrol had believed him because he gave them what they expected to see: a big, simple Negro who had made a foolish attempt at freedom and was now resigned to his fate. He was taken to a slave jail in Augusta, where he spent 2 weeks in chains, continuing his performance. He developed a convincing cough by breathing in dust and irritating his throat. He hunched his shoulders and moved slowly, as if exhausted. He spoke in the deferential tones that white people expected, always averting his eyes, always acting as if he had been beaten into submission. When the traders began preparing for the next auction, Elijah made sure to be placed in the category of questionable health. Valuable for his size, but risky because of the apparent illness. He knew that Richard Marlowe was known to attend these auctions looking for bargains, slaves he could purchase cheaply because of some minor defect, and then work to death in his fields. Sure enough, when the auction day came, Richard Marlowe was there. And when Elijah was brought onto the auction block, hunched and coughing, with his massive frame hidden beneath a posture of weakness, Marlowe's eyes lit up with greed. Here was a slave who looked like he could do tremendous work, available at a discount because of a temporary illness. The bidding was brief. Most buyers were skeptical of the cough, worried about disease. But Marlowe was confident, and when the auction ended, Elijah had a new owner. He had successfully infiltrated Oak Ridge Plantation. Now came the hard part. The first week at Oak Ridge was designed to break him, to test whether he was worth the investment Richard Marlowe had made. Elijah was assigned to the cotton fields, the most brutal work on the plantation, where men and women labored from dawn until well past dusk under the supervision of overseers who carried whips and used them liberally. The head overseer was a man named Garrett Pike, a veteran of plantation management, who had worked at Oak Ridge for 15 years. Pike was shorter than Elijah by a foot, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who held absolute power over other human beings. On Elijah's first morning, Pike looked him up and down with undisguised contempt. "So, you're the giant the master bought," Pike said, circling Elijah like a predator examining prey. "Big man with a cough. Let's see if you can actually work, or if the master wasted his money." Or Elijah kept his head down and said nothing, maintaining the submissive posture he had perfected. Pike smiled, a cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll be in the West Field starting today. You'll pick cotton from sunup to sundown. You'll fill your basket to the top, same as everyone else. If you fall behind, you'll be encouraged to work faster. If you slack off, you'll be reminded of your place. If you cause any trouble, you'll learn why runaways from Oak Ridge are so rare. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Elijah said quietly, injecting just the right amount of fear into his voice. "Good. Now get to work." The West Field stretched for acres, row after row of cotton plants heavy with bolls that needed to be picked. 40 slaves worked the field, their fingers moving with practiced efficiency as they plucked cotton and dropped it into the large baskets strapped to their backs. An overseer patrolled the rows on horseback, a whip coiled at his belt, watching for any sign of slacking. Elijah took his position at the end of a row and began picking. His massive hands, which could track a deer through miles of forest and set traps that even the craftiest predators couldn't avoid, now performed the mindless, repetitive task of pulling cotton from plants. He worked slowly at first, maintaining the appearance of weakness, coughing periodically to remind everyone of his supposed illness. But he was also observing, watching the overseer's patrol patterns, counting how many guards were visible at any given time, noting which slaves seemed broken and which still had fight in their eyes, learning the layout of the fields, the location of the tree line, the distance to various buildings. Every detail was stored away, pieces of a puzzle he was slowly assembling. By midday, his basket was only half full, far behind the other workers. The overseer on horseback noticed and rode over, stopping his horse inches from where Elijah stood. "You're slow, big man. Very slow. Surely a giant like you can pick faster than that." Elijah coughed and kept his eyes down. "Sorry, sir. Still feeling weak. I'll work faster." The overseer considered this, then, without warning, struck Elijah across the back with his whip. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Elijah forced himself not to react beyond a small flinch. He'd experienced pain before. Knife wounds from hunting accidents, broken bones from falls, burns from campfires. This was nothing he couldn't handle. But more importantly, he couldn't show strength, couldn't reveal that he was more than he appeared. "That's to help you remember to work faster," the overseer said. "Next time I come by, your basket better be fuller, or you'll get more than one." "Yes, sir," Elijah whispered. The overseer rode off, and Elijah resumed picking, now moving slightly faster, but still maintaining his performance of weakness. An older woman working nearby glanced at him with sympathy. "Don't let them rake you on the first day," she said quietly. "Pace yourself. Show just enough effort that they don't kill you, but not so much that they expect it every day." "Thank you," Elijah said, and meant it. This woman, her name was Abigail, he would learn later, had been at Oak Ridge for 20 years. She knew how to survive. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Sweat poured down Elijah's face and back. His hands, despite their size and strength, began to ache from the repetitive motion. But this was nothing compared to tracking game for days, through mountain wilderness. This was nothing compared to what his mother was enduring somewhere on this plantation. That thought kept him going. Ruth was here somewhere within these 400 acres. His mother was working, suffering, enduring. He just had to find her. By evening, when the bell finally rang to signal the end of the workday, Elijah's basket was nearly full. Not the fullest, but respectable enough that the overseers didn't punish him further. The slaves trudged back to their quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins that housed the plantation's labor force. The cabins were cramped, poorly maintained, and offered minimal protection from the elements. But they were shelter, and after 16 hours of work, even a thin mattress on a wooden floor seemed like luxury. Elijah was assigned to a cabin with 5 other men, all of them field workers. They eyed him warily as he entered, taking in his size, his apparent weakness, his status as a newcomer. "You the new giant?" asked one man, middle-aged with a scar across his cheek. His name was Moses.
"Yes,"
Elijah said simply. "You pick much cotton today?" "Not enough. Still sick." Moses nodded, accepting this. "Get better fast. Master don't keep sick slaves long. Either you work, or you get sold south to the rice plantations, and nobody survives rice country." The other men murmured agreement. Elijah filed this information away. Another piece of the puzzle. Oak Ridge was harsh, but apparently there were places even worse, and Marlowe wasn't above selling defective property to maximize his profit. That night, lying on his thin mattress while the others slept, Elijah began his real work. He had spent the day observing, learning the surface details of plantation life. But nights would be for deeper intelligence gathering, for moving silently through the darkness, avoiding detection, gathering the kind of information that would make his eventual plan possible. He waited until the cabin was silent except for snoring, then rose carefully. His size made stealth challenging, but his father had taught him how to move without sound, how to distribute his weight, how to breathe so quietly that even animals wouldn't detect him. These skills, honed over decades of hunting, now served a different purpose. He slipped out of the cabin into the humid Georgia night. The plantation was quiet, but not unguarded. Elijah could see torches in the distance, where overseers maintained patrol routes. He could hear dogs barking somewhere beyond the main house. Bloodhounds, probably, trained to track runaways. This would require careful navigation. He moved through the shadows between buildings, staying low, avoiding open spaces. His destination tonight was simple reconnaissance. Learn the layout of the quarters, identify which cabins housed which groups, locate the main house, the overseer residences, the storage buildings. Basic intelligence that would inform more complex operations later. As he crept past the women's quarters, he heard quiet weeping from inside one cabin. He paused, listening. A woman's voice, older, speaking in a tone that suggested she was comforting someone younger. The words were indistinct, but the emotion was clear: pain, loss, exhaustion. His mother was in one of these cabins. He didn't know which one yet. Didn't dare risk searching tonight, when he was still learning the patrol patterns. But knowing she was close made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't afford to indulge. Not yet. Not until he had a plan that would actually work. He continued his circuit, noting everything. The main house was large and well lit, even at night, with at least 2 people visible through windows. House slaves, probably, working late. The overseer cabins were positioned strategically around the property, ensuring that no area was completely unwatched. The storage buildings, where tools and supplies were kept, were locked but not heavily guarded. And in the distance, he could see the edge of the forest that bordered the plantation. Dark, dense, and offering potential escape routes if needed. After an hour of reconnaissance, Elijah returned to his cabin and slipped back onto his mattress. None of the other men had stirred. He lay there in the darkness, processing what he'd learned, beginning to form the outline of a plan that would require patience, precision, and a level of deception he'd never attempted before. He would need to maintain his performance of weakness for weeks, maybe months, long enough to earn a degree of trust, or at least to be dismissed as harmless, long enough to learn more about the overseers, their personalities, their weaknesses, their habits, long enough to make contact with his mother and assess her condition, long enough to identify allies among the slaves who might be willing to risk everything for freedom. And then, when the time was right, he would stop being Jonah's the weak field hand and become Elijah the hunter once more. And Richard Marlowe's plantation would learn what it meant to be prey. The next morning came too early, announced by a bell that rang across the plantation at dawn. The slaves rose immediately, knowing that delays resulted in punishment. They were given a brief period to eat a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and water before being marched back to the fields. Elijah fell into the routine, continuing his performance. He picked cotton slowly but steadily, just fast enough to avoid beatings, but not so fast as to seem healthy. He coughed at regular intervals. He hunched his shoulders and moved as if every step required effort. And he watched constantly, gathering more information. On the third day, he made his first important discovery. During the midday break, when slaves were allowed a few minutes to drink water and rest, he noticed a woman working in the adjacent field who moved with a familiar grace despite her obvious exhaustion. She was in her 50s, with gray threading through her hair, and even from a distance, even after 3 years of separation, Elijah recognized her. Ruth, his mother. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to speak to her, to assure her that help had come. But he forced himself to remain still. Any unusual behavior would be noted by the overseers. Any connection between them would be remembered. He couldn't risk it. Not yet. But knowing she was there, seeing with his own eyes that she was alive, gave him renewed determination. She looked older than he remembered, thinner, with a wariness that broke his heart. But she was alive, and he was going to get her out. That evening, he learned more about the plantation's hierarchy through conversations with his cabin mates. Moses, the scarred man, was surprisingly talkative once he decided Elijah wasn't a threat. Master Marlowe, he's mean but predictable. Moses explained as they ate their evening rations. Long as you work hard and don't cause trouble, he mostly leaves you alone. It's the mistress you got to watch out for. The mistress? Elijah asked, remembering the pale woman who had watched him arrive. Catherine Marlowe. Another man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. She's worse than the master in some ways. Master beats you when you fail. Mistress beats you when she's bored. And she's always watching, always suspicious. You can't trust her, not for a second. This was concerning. Elijah had been so focused on Richard Marlowe that he hadn't adequately considered his wife. A mistake he would need to correct. What about the overseers? He asked. 6 of them, Moses said. Pike's the worst. He's been here forever and knows every trick. Then there's Turner, Crawford, and the others. They're all armed, all mean, and they work in shifts, so there's always someone watching. And then there's the dogs. How many dogs? 5 bloodhounds. Big ones trained to track runaways. They've caught every slave who's tried to escape in the last 10 years. Those dogs are the real reason nobody runs. You can maybe outsmart the overseers, but you can't outsmart a bloodhound's nose. Elijah filed this information away. 5 dogs. That was actually fewer than he'd feared. And dogs, despite their reputation, were animals with predictable behaviors. He'd hunted with dogs, tracked with dogs, and most importantly, he'd learned how to evade dogs when necessary. They weren't invincible. Anyone ever succeed in escaping? He asked casually. The cabin fell silent. Moses looked at him with something like pity. Why are you asking? You thinking about running, big man? You'll be dead in a week. Or worse, you'll be caught and made an example of. Master Marlowe don't just whip runaways. He breaks them, makes them wish they'd never been born, and then he sells them south to places where they work you to death in 6 months. Don't even think about it. I'm not. Elijah lied. Just curious. But the conversation told him something important. The slaves at Oak Ridge had been so thoroughly broken, so convinced of the impossibility of escape, that they wouldn't even consider it. This meant he couldn't count on mass cooperation. When the time came, he would have to act with a small, trusted group, or possibly alone. Over the following weeks, Elijah settled into the brutal routine of plantation life while secretly continuing his nocturnal reconnaissance. He mapped every building, every patrol route, every dog kennel. He identified the locations where supplies were stored, where weapons were kept, where the overseers slept. He learned which guards were alert and which were lazy, which dogs were truly dangerous, and which were mostly for show. And gradually, carefully, he began to make contact with slaves who seemed like potential allies. Not many. Trust was a luxury that enslaved people couldn't afford. But a few. Abigail, the older woman who had shown him kindness on his first day, a young man named Samuel who still had fire in his eyes, a woman named Clara who worked in the main house and had access to information about the Marlowe's schedules and habits. He didn't reveal his true purpose. Not yet. He simply established himself as someone who listened, who was thoughtful, who might be more than he appeared. Seeds that would grow when the time came. A month after his arrival, Elijah finally found an opportunity to speak directly with his mother. It happened during a Sunday afternoon, the one time when slaves were given a few hours of rest. He had learned that Ruth spent her Sundays in a small garden behind the women's quarters, tending vegetables that supplemented the plantation's food supplies. He approached carefully, making sure no overseers were watching. When he was close enough, he spoke quietly without looking directly at her. Mama. Ruth's hands froze over the tomato plant she'd been tending. Her breath caught. Slowly, she turned to look at him, and Elijah saw recognition dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by terror. No, she whispered. No, you can't be here. Elijah, what have you done? I came for you, he said simply. I came to take you home. Tears spilled down her cheeks. You fool. You beautiful, stupid fool. Do you know what they'll do if they find out? Do you know what they'll do to both of us? They won't find out, not until it's too late. How? Her voice was desperate. How can you possibly? Elijah, there are 6 overseers, 5 dogs, patrols every night. Master Marlowe is connected to every sheriff and slave catcher in 3 counties. Even if we ran, we'd be caught before we made it 10 miles. Then we don't run, Elijah said. Not yet. Not until I've prepared everything. Mama, trust me. I'm not the boy you raised. I'm a hunter, and I've spent the last month learning everything about this place. When I move, it will work. I promise you. Ruth stared at him, seeing perhaps for the first time that her son had become something formidable, something dangerous. What do you need from me? She finally asked. Information about the Marlows, about the house, about anything that might be useful, and patience. This won't happen tomorrow, but it will happen. Over the next several minutes, speaking in urgent whispers, Ruth shared everything she knew. She told him about Richard Marlowe's schedule, his business trips to Savannah that happened quarterly. She told him about Catherine's habits, her tendency to ride out to the fields on horseback to inspect the work. She told him about the main house's layout, including a study where Marlowe kept his personal weapons and papers. Most importantly, she told him about the one night each year when the plantation's guard was at its lowest, the harvest celebration. It was a tradition at Oak Ridge that when the cotton harvest was complete, Richard Marlowe hosted a large party for neighboring plantation owners. The event required all the house slaves to work in the main house, and the overseers were often drunk by midnight, celebrating with the white guests. It was the only time when security was truly lax. "When is the harvest celebration this year?" Elijah asked. 6 weeks. Early October. Perfect. Elijah felt pieces of his plan clicking into place. "That's when we move." "We?" Ruth asked. "We can't free everyone, even if we could escape ourselves, trying to take 40 other people." "Not 40. Elijah interrupted. "But not just 2, either. I've been watching, Mama. There are people here who deserve freedom, who would fight for it if they believed it was possible. We're going to give them that chance." Ruth looked at her son, this man who had infiltrated a plantation, who had spent weeks playing weak while gathering intelligence, who spoke with a quiet confidence that came from genuine capability rather than bravado. And she felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years' hope. "Tell me your plan," she said. And for the next 20 minutes, while pretending to work in the garden, Elijah outlined exactly how he intended to destroy Richard Marlowe's operation and free not just his mother, but as many enslaved people as were willing to risk everything for liberation. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It relied on perfect timing and flawless execution. But it could work. And that night, as Elijah lay in his cabin pretending to sleep, he allowed himself a small smile. The trap was set. The prey had no idea what was coming, and in 6 weeks, Oak Ridge Plantation would learn what happened when you enslaved a hunter's mother. The giant they thought they'd bought wasn't weak, wasn't simple, wasn't broken. He was the most dangerous man they'd ever encounter, and their time was running out. The 6 weeks between Elijah's conversation with his mother and the harvest celebration passed with agonizing slowness. Each day, a carefully choreographed performance of submission, while he refined every detail of his plan. The work in the cotton fields continued its brutal rhythm dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons offering any respite. But Elijah used every moment strategically, turning his enslavement into an extended reconnaissance mission. His illness began to show signs of improvement, but slowly, gradually, in a way that seemed natural. He coughed less frequently. His posture straightened slightly. His cotton picking increased from half a basket per day to 3/4, then to a full basket. The overseers noticed and were pleased. Their investment was paying off. Richard Marlowe himself commented during one of his infrequent visits to the fields that the giant was finally earning his keep. Catherine Marlowe, however, remained suspicious. Elijah noticed her watching him more than the other slaves. Her eyes narrowed, as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite articulate. She would ride out to the fields on her chestnut mare, ostensibly to inspect the work. But Elijah could feel her gaze lingering on him longer than necessary. It was unsettling, this attention, but he never acknowledged it. Never gave her any reason to think he was anything other than what he appeared to be. During the 4th week of his preparation, Catherine approached him directly. It was midday, the sun blazing overhead, and Elijah was drinking water from the communal bucket when her horse stopped beside him. He immediately lowered his eyes, the gesture of deference so practiced now it was almost natural. You, she said, her voice sharp. Jonas, isn't it?
Yes,
Mom, Elijah replied quietly, not looking up. You've been here a month now. You're working better, stronger.
yes, Mom.
Thank you, ma'am. Look at me when I speak to you. Elijah raised his eyes slowly, making sure his expression showed nothing but respectful attention. Catherine studied his face for a long moment, her own expression unreadable. There's something about you, she said finally. Something I can't quite identify. You're different from the others. Smarter, perhaps. More aware. Every instinct screamed at Elijah to deny this, to deflect, to return to his performance of simple, minded obedience. But Catherine was perceptive in a way her husband wasn't, and complete denial might seem suspicious in itself. So he chose a middle path. Just trying to work hard, ma'am. Trying to be useful. Don't want to be sold south. Catherine's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Sold south. Yes, that's every slave's nightmare, isn't it? The rice plantations, the sugar fields, places where Negroes die faster than they can be replaced. She paused, watching his reaction. Are you afraid of that, Jonas? Yes, Mum, Elijah said honestly, because that much was true. He had heard the stories of those plantations, where enslaved people were literally worked to death within months. It was a fate he wouldn't wish on anyone. Good. Fear keeps you obedient. Fear keeps you alive. Catherine turned her horse to leave, then stopped. My husband thinks he got a bargain when he bought you, a strong worker at half price because of a temporary illness. But I wonder if perhaps you're more trouble than you're worth. She rode away without waiting for a response, leaving Elijah standing there with his heart pounding. This was dangerous. Catherine's suspicion. Even if she couldn't articulate exactly what she suspected, was a threat to everything he'd planned. He would need to be even more careful around her. That evening, he shared his concern with Ruth. During one of their carefully arranged brief encounters, they had developed a system where they could exchange a few words during Sunday afternoons without attracting attention. And occasionally, when Ruth was assigned to work in the vegetable garden, Elijah could engineer reasons to be nearby. Catherine's always been like that, Ruth said quietly, her hands moving mechanically as she pulled weeds. She watches everyone, looking for signs of resistance, of intelligence, of anything that might threaten their control. But she can't do anything based on suspicion alone. Just keep being what they expect to see. What if she convinces Marlowe to sell me before the harvest celebration? She won't. Richard's too pleased with your cotton production. As long as you keep working hard, he won't get rid of you. Catherine may suspect something, but she has no proof, and Richard doesn't listen to her hunches. Elijah nodded, filing this information away. It highlighted something he'd already observed. The marriage between Richard and Catherine. Marlowe was not one of equals. Catherine was intelligent and perceptive, but in the world they inhabited, her opinions mattered less than her husband's financial calculations. As long as Elijah was profitable, he was safe. During the 5th week, Elijah began the most dangerous phase of his preparation, recruiting allies. He had identified 5 slaves who seemed like potential collaborators. People who still had fight in them, who weren't completely broken by the system. The challenge was approaching them without revealing too much, without creating a conspiracy so large that someone might betray it out of fear or hope of reward. His first recruit was Abigail, the older woman who had shown him kindness on his first day. She was 50, 7 years old, had been enslaved at Oak Ridge for 22 years, and had a quiet strength that came from surviving unspeakable hardships. Elijah approached her one Sunday afternoon, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Abigail, can I ask you something? If you had a chance, a real chance, to be free, would you take it, even if it meant risking your life?" Abigail's hand stilled over the quilt she was mending. She didn't look at him, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "Every slave dreams of freedom, Jonas, but dreams don't mean anything when the reality is dogs and whips and slave catchers. Why are you asking? Because dreams can become reality if you plan carefully enough. If you're willing to be patient. If you're willing to fight when the moment comes." Now Abigail did look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Who are you, really? You're not what you pretend to be, are you?" "I'm someone who keeps promises," Elijah said. "And I promised myself I'd free my mother from this place. But I can't do it alone. I need people I can trust. People who are willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom." "Your mother?" Abigail repeated slowly. "Ruth, the woman in the vegetable garden. I should have seen it. You have her eyes. Will you help?" Abigail was silent for a long moment, weighing the risk against the possibility. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next 2 weeks, Elijah carefully recruited 4 more allies: Samuel, a 23-year-old field hand who had seen his wife sold away the previous year and burned with quiet rage; Clara, who worked in the main house and had,